Welcome to Life of Styn, where our goal is to make your life yours again. And today we're going to be talking about the all that you are. Who are we? What are we? Why are we? What's the point of it all? And who's in control? A lot of these things I have taught up to this point, I've kind of been beating around the bush. The reason for that is because sometimes it becomes a lot easier to digest this material when you build up to it. Just like when I was growing up, anytime I heard someone talk about God, I was immediately turned off and discredited anything that person had to say. I was very closed minded. But I've learned that even if I don't ascribe to certain belief systems, and now I don't really ascribe to any one in particular, there's always something I can learn from it, whether it is about myself or others. I've always been so interested in the why people are the way they are, why they think or feel the way they do. Anyways, there's something I've wanted to convey for a while and haven't necessarily been able to find the right words or the best way to explain. And I've heard many other teachers explain it in 1,000 different ways, and it's hard because it's almost like a if you know, you know type thing. But what is a good way to explain something in a universal way for all types of people, religious or scientific, Eastern or Western? What's a good way to open up their minds? You hear a lot of things that we kind of just take at face value and chalk it up to nut jobs, or something that doesn't really have a lot of meaning and we don't really investigate it for ourselves. Well, maybe you've heard of enlightenment, or not, and maybe it sounds crazy or out of reach. Maybe you've heard me or other teachers talk about oneness or God, Buddha, the Tao, Brahma, Allah, non duality, Zen, or maybe you've heard of more scientific things like energy, photons, quantum mechanics, or some just call it, the universe. Well, after all my research, I feel Alan Watts explained it the best in his talk, Zen Reconsidered. This comes from the Be Here Now network, and I urge you to check it out. But I'll be covering just the first part of his talk in the intro. So let's get started. Mark Watts, Alan Watts' son, starts by introducing himself as the host of the podcast and says this. Today, we're going to be exploring the archives a bit more, and in particular, going toward a seminar called Zen Reconsidered. And I was listening to this the other day, and it was very interesting because he opens up by talking about his own qualifications to teach about Zen. And he says he hasn't been trained as a Roshi, and he hasn't sat for great periods of time in meditation. And he actually comes into the house from a side window. And he compares this to Hinduism, where some teachings come in through the front door, which is reserved for honored guests. Some teachings come in from the back door, which is usually where the garbage is taken out. But those teachings get into the house that way, and they stay there because they are important. But he likes to come in through a side window, he says, like a thief, because he wants to see what it's really made out of. He wants to see what's underneath the front stairs that everybody enters on. So this is a uniquely psychological approach, and this struck me as a particularly interesting. Because I've been hearing a lot of AI Alan Watts lately, and it actually seems to me a lot like a brown-nosing graduate student who has a lot of information, but doesn't really understand much of it. And of course, this is rooted in the fact that AI, of course, can't grasp meaning. But there's something behind that in that it can't understand the psychology or the human needs and responses to philosophy in a meaningful way. So when I heard this, I was kind of delighted because it gives a good explanation as to why a straightforward approach or an empirical approach, which is what AI uses, is not going to be that effective. And I think you'll enjoy it if it has a lot of color and is great context for diving back into his thoughts on Zen. So we're going to be listening to Alan Watts in another talk from the Being in the Way podcast, Zen Reconsidered, the whole thing about Zen. Now we're going to pan over to the actual recording of Alan Watts, and he starts by saying, what is Zen? Now, mind you here, he speaks pretty universally, and this can answer a lot of questions. Sub in any of the things you would like God or universe, or it doesn't really matter because what he talks about here is all talking about the same thing, which is why I like to use the term the all, like the Hermeticists use, because that hasn't really acquired a bad stigma or a stigma at all, kind of like God or universe does. One thing I always struggled with growing up was not being able to prove or disprove God, and I always struggled with science because as soon as new data is acquired, theories can collapse. One thing I discovered in my journey is that you can discover the truth and you can answer the unanswerable questions and discover what is going on. Anyways, back into the talk. Sorry about my side tangent. Alan Watts says, "What is Zen? Is extraordinarily simple when one doesn't try to be cute about it and beat around the bush. Then is simply the sensation, totally clear understanding. That to put it in Zen terms, 10,000 formations, one suchness. Or you might say the 10,000 things that is everything is of one suchness. That is to say that there is simply behind and appearing as the multiplicity of events and creatures in this universe simply one energy, and you're it, and everything is it. And the work of Zen is to understand that, has to say so, has to feel it in your bones. But Zen has nothing to say, one suchness about what that energy is, and this, of course, gives the impression in the minds of Westerners that it is like we would say blind energy, because the only alternative to that we can suppose thinking in terms of our traditions is that it's something like God. That is to say, something kind of like a cosmic ego, an intelligent being, almost personal, but that in the Buddhistic view would be as far off the point as thinking of it as blind energy. The reason why this word suchness is used is to leave the whole thing open and absolutely free from definition, because the whole point about this energy is that it should be an unformulated. That is not to say formless in the sense of, some kind of goo, um, some side of goo, thank you, which is just a featureless mess. It means that at the basis of everything, there is something which, in the nature of things, never could be made an object, discerned, figured out, explained. We, just in the same way, just have exactly the same way the eyes, when seeing, apparently have no color and no form of their own. If the eyes had a form of their own, they would distort all the forms that we see. And perhaps in some sense they do if the eyes had a color of their own. That is to say, if the lens had a color, it would screen out that color in nature. And so you would not see it. You would never be aware of it, but we are not aware of the color of the eye of the lens because it is basic to all sight. And so, in exactly the same way, one would never be aware of the structure, the nature of the basic energy of the world, because you are it and everything is it. And you might say, well, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make any difference then. And if it's true, it doesn't. But if it does make a difference in the life and feeling of a person who realizes that, although it doesn't make any particular difference to anything that happens except this one important matter, if there was no way there would be no sight, it's true. We have this sight, and that the structure of the eye doesn't make any difference to this sight. But upon it depends the possibility of seeing. And so upon this energy depends the whole possibility of there being a universe. That's rather important, but it's so important that we overlook it. It doesn't enter, shall we say, into practical considerations and prognostication. That's true, and therefore modern logicians in the philosophy department will argue that all assertions about this energy, has that it is there at all, are meaningless, and that in a way is true, because the world itself, from the point of view of a strict logic, quite meaningless in the sense that it is not a sign or a symbol pointing to something else. So then, while that is all taken for granted, it nevertheless makes a great deal of difference to how you feel about this world, and therefore to how you act if you know that there is just this, and that it is you, and that it is beyond time, beyond space, beyond definition, and that if you clearly come to a realization that this is how things are, it gives you a certain bounce. You can enter into life with an abandon, with a freedom from basic terror, which you would not ordinarily have. Yes, you can be very hooked on the form of life which you are now living. You can consider that, myself say, as Alan Watts, is an immensely important event and one I wish to preserve and continue as long as possible. But the truth of the matter is that I know I won't be able to, and that everything falls apart in the end. But if you realize this fundamental energy, you have the prospect of appearing again in innumerable forms, all of which when you're in them, will seem just as important as this one you have now. So just as problematic, perhaps, too, only this is not something to be believed in, because if you believe that this is so upon hearsay, then you've missed the point completely, because you don't need to believe in this. You don't need to formulate it. If you don't need to hang on to it in any way, because you can't get away from it. There is no need to believe in it. And if you do believe in it, it indicates that you have some doubts. In the matter, that is why Zen has been called the religion of no religion. You don't need, as it were, to cling to yourself. Faith in yourself is not holding on to yourself. And that is why when some Zen master is given by his student the statement 10,000 formations, one suchness, Zen master says get rid of it. And that is why also in the practice of certain forms of Zen meditation, there is a rugged struggle of the person to get beyond all formulations whatsoever, to throw away all hang-ups, to endure long hours of sitting with aching knees and perpetual frustration, and trying to get a hold of what all this is about with tremendous earnestness. I've got to find out what the mystery of life is, who I am, what this energy is. And you go, and he knocks down every formulation you bring to him, because you don't need one. Only the ordinary person on hearing that you don't need one will forget all about it and go and think about something else. So he never crosses the life and death barrier. And when you do see it, it is just so obvious, so totally obvious, that there is just one energy, and that consciousness and unconsciousness, being and not being, life and death, are its polarities. It is always undulating in this way. Now you see it, now you don't. Now it's here, now it isn't. Because that's on and off is the energy. We wouldn't know the energy was there unless it was vibrating. And the only way to vibrate is to go on and off. So life and death, it's like that. And that's what Zen's about. And that's all it's about, of course. Other things deprived from that in Zen training, the first thing to do is to understand, to get the feeling of its complete obviousness. But then what follows from that is how does a person who feels that way live in this world? What do you do about other people who don't see that? So what do you do about conducting yourself in this world? Well, that is a really difficult part of Zen training. There's at first the breakthrough, which involves certain difficulties, but thereafter, there's the whole question of learning compassion and tact and skill, as Jesus put it, to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. And that is really what takes most of the time. You might divide, I apologize. And that is really what takes most of the time. You might divide then the training in Zen into two stages, corresponding to the two great schools of Buddhism, the Hinana stage and the Mahayana stage. The Hinana stage is to get to nirvana, to get to living in the great void. But then the Mahayana stage is to come back as the Bodh comes back from the nirvana out of compassion for all sentient beings, to help even grass to become enlightened. And so it is that Mahayana aspect of Zen which occupies most of the time of learning to be proficient in Zen. Well, I say this by the way of introduction, just to make everything clear from the start, and without being deceptive about it or befuddling you with Zen stories, where although they are really quite clear, the point doesn't get across very easily to Westerners, except as something fascinating with the principle, of course, underlying Zen stories, with all of their strangely seeming irrelevant remarks, is quite simple. It's all explained in the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch Kwang, when he says, if somebody asks you a question about matters sacred, always answer in terms of matters profane. If they ask you about the ultimate reality, answer in terms of everyday life. If they ask you about everyday life, answer in terms of ultimate reality. Master, please hand me the knife. And he hands him the knife blade first. Please give me the other end, he says. What would you do with the other end? Now, this is answering an everyday matter in terms of the metaphysical master. What is the fundamental principle of Buddhism? There is enough breeze in this fan to keep me cool. And that is answering the metaphysical in terms of the everyday. And that's more or less the principle. It works. Now, that's where I'm going to stop. If you like what you hear and are invested in this video, then go ahead and check out the rest of the video. I'll link it in the description. I hope the late Alan Watts doesn't mind that I share his material. I imagine not, because like him, like me, and all other teachers, we are just trying to teach the world the same thing. Some people just aren't aware of it. Some people think their way is the only right way, but nevertheless. Now, let's not be ignorant here. This doesn't mean Zen is the one true way and everything else is wrong. I've said before that there are infinite paths and one is not better or worse, but all paths lead to this one path. Even steps taken astray from the path are the correct, necessary steps. The journey is the destination, and it's right now. What more can I say now that hasn't already been stated? Like I've said at the Life of Styn, we want to understand what is all really going on here, but also we want to improve our lives. So whether you're here for the practical or for some of the deeper stuff, like either or. Now, someone struggling to survive doesn't give two shits about spirituality or why we are here, etc., etc. And some people might be great spiritually and are doing terrible in the mundane day to day life. We here want to improve all aspects. We want to just make it okay again, and if you're ready to take new leaps, we can take new steps. Believe it or not, while I love teaching, I love helping and making a difference, I like to see others thrive, I actually enjoy discovering more about myself and reality just a tiny bit more. It's a win-win for me because the more I discover, the more I share, and I get to cross both off of my list. I hope this has opened your mind a little or has answered some questions you have, whatever it may be. If you've made it this far, thank you. I appreciate you. Please like, subscribe, comment, share with someone you think might like or need this. And if you have any questions, please comment down below. This kind of work and material could be very open-ended and very easily be misinterpreted. And I can clear up any confusion you might have. And maybe in the future, if the questions pile up, I can do a separate Q&A video. Anyways, don't be so hard on yourself and have the day you were meant to have.